Part 1. The Resonance of Loss. The first universe Alex Dorn bled into was a place of silent stone and perpetual twilight. He didn't arrive so much as he was excised from his own reality and pasted into this one. There was no gentle transition, no shimmering portal. One moment, he was standing in his basement laboratory, the air thick with the ozone smell of burnt electronics and his own desperate sweat. The next, he was on his knees, vomiting onto lichen-crusted granite. The memory of his world's light a searing afterimage on his retinas. The machine, the Dissonance engine he'd christened it in a fit of melodramatic hope, had worked. It had torn a hole in the skin of the world, and it had nearly torn him apart in the process. Every cell in his body screamed, a chorus of protest against an unnatural act. His bones felt like they had been ground to powder and hastily reassembled by an indifferent hand. When the pain subsided to a tolerable, ever-present thrum, he pushed himself up, his hands scraping on the rough stone. He was on a vast, empty plain under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. No sun, no stars, just a sourceless, suffocating gloom. The air was cold and thin, carrying a metallic tang that coated his tongue. "Natasha," he whispered, the name a prayer, a curse, the only thing that had kept him breathing for the 2 years since the car crash. There was no answer. Only the wind, hissing across the plain like a dying thing. He had theorized this. The anchor point. The engine didn't just fling him randomly. It was tuned to her unique quantum resonance, the faint fading echo of her existence that, according to his fringe physics, still reverberated through the infinite layers of the multiverse. He was a needle and Natasha was his magnet. This desolate place was simply the first point where her signal was strong enough to manifest a bridge. He checked the equipment strapped to his body. The Dissonance engine was a heavy, brutalist contraption of wires, capacitors, and a core of shimmering, unstable Cherenkov blue energy housed in a lead-lined box. It was powered by a miniature cold fusion cell he'd stolen from the research facility where he used to work. It was also his only way home, a concept that grew more abstract with every passing second. A Geiger counter-like device, the resonance tracker, was strapped to his wrist. Its screen was dark. For 3 days he walked. He drank from brackish puddles that tasted of rust. He ate nothing. Hunger was a distant concern, overshadowed by a dread that was slowly crystallizing into certainty. This was a dead universe. A fossil, nothing lived here. Nothing could. On the 4th day, the tracker beeped. A weak, flickering signal. His heart hammered against his ribs. He followed the pulse, his exhaustion forgotten, his hope a frantic, scrabbling thing. It led him to a shallow depression in the stone, and there she was, Natasha. Or a thing that had once been Natasha Lane. It was a skeleton, picked clean by the elements, still clad in the tattered, gray rags of the blue dress she'd been buried in. It was posed, almost artfully, on its back, one arm outstretched as if beckoning. The tracker screeched, its needle pinned in the red. Alex fell to his knees, a sob tearing from his throat. This wasn't finding her. This was finding her grave in a world where no one had ever mourned her. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the cool, dry bone of her wrist. The moment he made contact, the universe shifted. It wasn't a visual change. It was a fundamental rewriting of the rules. The silent, pressing gloom was suddenly filled with a low, guttural hum. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a vibration you felt in your teeth, in the marrow of your bones. The skeleton in front of him began to twitch. The bones clattered against the stone, not with the randomness of collapse, but with a horrifying, deliberate purpose. The skull turned, its empty sockets fixing on him. The jaw unhinged, and from it came not a voice, but a projection, a psychic scream of such profound, universe-spanning agony that Alex felt his own sanity fray at the edges. Images, sensations, memories that were not his own flooded his mind. The crash, the shattering glass, the cold metal twisting around her, the last choked breath, but then it went further, past her death. He felt the tearing of her consciousness as the Dissonance engine, in his own universe, first activated, pulling at the loose thread of her existence. He felt her soul being shredded across the realities, A piece of her landing here, in this stone coffin, to die alone and aware for centuries. This wasn't a ghost. It was a scar, a fossilized echo of her death, imprinted on this dead reality, given a vile semblance of life by the very energy he was using to search for her. The skeleton thing that was and was not Natasha scrambled towards him, moving with the jerky, insectile speed of a nightmare. Its finger bones, sharp as daggers, scraped against the chest plate of his survival suit. Alex screamed, scrambling backward. He fumbled for the engine's control panel on his belt. There was no time for finesse, no time to calculate a destination. He just prayed and slammed his palm onto the activation rune. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of screaming colors and forces that felt like they were peeling his skin off. Part 2. The Flesh That Hates. He rematerialized in a swamp. The air was thick, hot, and heavy with the stench of rot and blooming fungi. Giant phosphorescent mushrooms cast a sickly green light, and the trees were twisted, weeping a thick black sap. The transition was marginally less violent, his body learning, against its will, how to survive the journey. He collapsed into the knee-deep, warm water, retching. This time, nothing came up but bile. The memory of the skeletal Natasha, the psychic scream of her death echo, was burned into his mind. He had been searching for his wife. He had found a monument to her suffering. Was this all that was left? Fragments of her pain, scattered across creation? He checked the resonance tracker. It was active, showing a faint signal pulsing from the north. Different from the first. Softer. A different frequency of her soul. He had to believe that. He had to believe that somewhere in the infinite sprawl there was a whole Natasha. A living one. The one he had lost. He pushed on, the water clinging to his legs like 1,000 cold, weak hands. The horrors of this universe were not silent. They were loud, wet, and visceral. Things moved in the murk. Not fish, not reptiles, but pulsating, amorphous blobs of flesh that seemed to be little more than mouths and digestive tracts. They ignored him, focused on consuming each other. After an hour of waiting, he saw the first sign of something resembling civilization. A structure, or the ruins of one, built from the weeping trees and packed mud. As he drew closer, he saw they were huts, arranged in a crude circle. And there were people, or what had once been people. They were humanoid, but their flesh was wrong. It was translucent in patches, revealing pulsing organs and networks of black veins. Some had extra limbs, vestigial and twitching. Others had mouths that split their faces vertically. They moved with a sluggish, pained gait, tending to patches of fungal growth. One of them, a being with one normal eye and one that was a complex, faceted orb like a fly's, looked up and saw him. It didn't scream. It didn't attack. It let out a low, mournful groan and pointed a trembling, fingerless hand towards the center of the village. The tracker's pulse quickened. She was here. Hope, treacherous and bright, flared in his chest again. He moved forward, his weapon, a high-voltage cattle prod he'd modified, held ready. The villagers watched him, their expressions unreadable, a mixture of curiosity and profound sorrow. In the center of the village was a larger hut. The entrance was covered by a curtain of what looked like strung-together intestines, dry and leathery. The signal was strong, overwhelming. He pushed the curtain aside. The inside was lit by the same fungal growth. And in the center, sitting on a throne of woven bones and wet black wood, was Natasha. She was whole. Flesh and blood. She wore a gown of living moss and glowing lichen. Her hair, her beautiful auburn hair, was longer, braided with feathers and small polished bones. She was beautiful. She was alive. "Alex?" she said, her voice a melody he thought he'd never hear again. It was her. It was her. Tears streamed down his face. He dropped the cattle prod, took a step forward. "Natasha." "Oh God, Natasha. I found you." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. They were her eyes, the same shade of hazel, but they held a depth of knowledge, of sorrow, that his Natasha had never possessed. "You are not from this world. she said, her voice calm, resonant. You are the source of the dissonance, the one who has been tearing at the seams. I came for you, he pleaded, his voice cracking. The car, you died. I built a machine to find you. I know, she said softly. I felt it. All of me felt it. The me that died in your world. The me that died in 1,000 others. And the me that lived. She gestured around her. This is a world of flesh, Alex. A universe where the barrier between organisms is thin. We are all connected here. A great suffering biomass. I am their nexus. I feel their pain. I regulate their growth. I am their queen and their prisoner. He didn't care. She was here. He could touch her. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees before her throne. He reached for her hand. Her skin was warm, soft. It was her hand, and then it changed. Where his fingers touched, her flesh rippled. It softened, lost its cohesion, and began to flow over his hand like warm wax. He tried to pull back, but it was too late. Her flesh adhered to his, merging, bonding. He could feel her cells, her biology, trying to absorb him, to pull him into the great connected biomass of this world. He screamed, yanking his arm back with all his strength. There was a sound like tearing Velcro, and a layer of his skin and a part of hers ripped away. He scrambled backward, clutching his bleeding, burning hand. The flesh on his palm was already blistering, turning a sickly, translucent gray. The thing on the throne that wore Natasha's face looked down at him, its expression now one of pity and hunger. You see? She said, her voice still melodic. You cannot have me without having all of this. My love for you is real, Alex, a memory from a dead world. But here love is a function of consumption. To be one is to be whole, stay, become part of me. Part of us. The villagers had gathered at the entrance, their mournful groans turning into a low, hungry chorus. Their flesh was undulating, reaching for him. Alex, his mind shattering, fumbled for the engine. He couldn't think, couldn't aim. He just activated it. The world of flesh dissolved into a torrent of screaming biological data. Part 3. The City of Static. He landed on something hard and flat. The air was filled with a deafening, constant roar. He was in a city, but a city like none he had ever seen. Towers of rusted iron and pitted chrome clawed at a sky choked with oily, black smoke. Flying machines that were more like jagged metal insects buzzed between them. The streets were rivers of filthy humanity, all moving with a frantic, desperate energy. The smell was a physical assault. Ozone, sewage, and roasting meat of an unidentifiable origin. This universe was alive, teeming, and utterly hostile. His hand was a mess. The flesh from the previous world was still actively trying to consume his own. With a cry of pure terror, he drew the monomolecular blade from his belt and, in one swift, agonizing motion, sliced away the infected tissue. The chunk of his palm and fingers fell to the grimy street, sizzling and morphing into a small, pulsating lump of flesh before being trampled by the crowd. He wrapped the bleeding stump in a field dressing from his pack, his vision swimming with pain. The resonance tracker was going wild. The signal was everywhere and nowhere. It was a constant, low-level scream from the very atmosphere. Natasha was here. Or, a version of her had been here, so strongly that her resonance had seeped into the fabric of this reality. He was jostled, shoved, cursed at in guttural tongues. The people were pale, gaunt, their eyes hollow. Many had crude cybernetic implants, jagged metal limbs, optical lenses grafted directly into their skulls, vocalizers replacing their mouths. They looked at him with his clean survival suit and strange technology with a mixture of fear and predatory hunger. He had to get off the street. He ducked into a narrow alley, choked with refuse and the bodies of those who had simply given up and died. He leaned against a wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was losing blood. He was losing his mind. The images of the skeleton, the flesh hive queen, they played on a loop behind his eyes. What am I doing? The thought was a cold spike in his heart. Is there even a Natasha to save? Or am I just collecting the ghosts of her murder? A hand clamped over his mouth from behind. Another pressed the cold, sharp edge of a blade against his throat. Shiny tech. A raspy, mechanized voice hissed in his ear. The overlords will pay well for it. And for your meat, survival instinct honed by the last two horrors kicked in. He drove his elbow back into his attacker's gut, hearing a satisfying oof. The grip on his mouth loosened. He spun, driving the stump of his wounded hand into the man's face. The man, a scrawny creature with a metal jaw and one glowing red eye, screamed as the bloody bandage smeared across his vision. Alex didn't hesitate. He grabbed his cattle prod and jammed it into the man's neck. There was a crackle of electricity, the smell of burnt flesh and ozone, and the man convulsed before collapsing to the ground, twitching. He stood there, panting, looking at the body. He had just killed a man, or something close to one. There was no time for remorse. This was the law of this place. Consume or be consumed. He rifled through the man's rags, finding a few rusted tools and a small, tarnished locket. He pried it open. Inside was a faded photograph. It was Natasha. A different Natasha. Her hair was shaved on one side and a complex tribal tattoo covered the other. Her face was smudged with grime, but her eyes held the same fierce fire his wife had possessed. This was a Natasha who had fought to survive in this hell. The signal on his tracker, which had been a general cacophony, suddenly focused. It was pulsing from the locket itself. This man had been close to her. Recently, a new, desperate plan formed in his mind. He couldn't just wander. He had to find this Natasha, the one who had lived here, who had maybe even thrived. She would be stronger than the echoes. She would understand. He spent the next day navigating the nightmarish city, which he learned was called the Grinder. He traded a small, worthless-looking but high-tech component from his pack for information. Food that tasted like grease and despair, and a crude, spring-loaded prosthetic claw to fit over his ruined hand. The information was always the same. They spoke of Natasha Lane in hushed, reverent tones. She was a legend, a rebel. The woman who had stood against the overlords, the cyborg masters of the Grinder. She had been captured. She was being held in the Spire, the tallest, most fortified tower in the city center, where the air was said to be clean and the overlords conducted their cruel experiments. He knew what he had to do. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only path forward that didn't lead to madness. Infiltration was a blur of violence and terror. He used the Dissonance engine not to jump worlds, but to create localized shudders, moments of spatial instability that shorted out security systems and disoriented guards. He fought his way through levels of the Spire, his modified cattle prod and monomolecular blade leaving a trail of sparking, dismembered cyborgs. He was no soldier, but he was driven by a love that had curdled into a feral, obsessive need. He finally found her in a sterile, white laboratory at the Spire's peak. She was suspended in a cylindrical tube filled with amber fluid, naked, her body crisscrossed with wires and tubes that fed into and out of her flesh. Her head was shaved and her scalp was embedded with neural interface ports. Her eyes were open, staring sightlessly at nothing. This Natasha was not a queen. She was a battery, a processor. The overlords were using her unique, multiversal resonance, the very thing he was tracking, to power their city, to fuel their technologies, to peer into other worlds. The tracker was screaming, its screen a solid block of red. "Natasha," he breathed, pressing his hands against the cool glass. Her eyes focused. They shifted slowly and locked onto his. There was recognition there, and an immense bottomless pain. Alex. Her voice was a distorted whisper from a speaker grill on the tube. "You came? I'm here. I'm getting you out." "No," she gasped, the word laced with static. "You don't understand. They've mapped me. They're using me to find your world, your technology. They're coming." As she spoke, alarms blared throughout the Spire. Red light flooded the lab. He had triggered a security lockdown. "Leave me," she pleaded. The machine. Use it, go home, destroy it. Before they follow the trail, he couldn't, not again. Not after coming so close. He smashed the control panel for the tube with the hilt of his blade. The amber fluid began to drain with a hiss. The wires detached, retracting into the ceiling with a whir of servos. Natasha collapsed as the tube opened and he caught her. She was emaciated, cold, her skin covered in scars and ports. He held her, this broken, used-up version of the woman he loved. She was a survivor, yes, but she had been hollowed out, turned into a tool. "I can save you," he whispered. His voice thick with tears. She looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw not love, but a desperate final plea. "You already have," she said. Then, with a strength that surprised him, she reached up and grabbed the resonance tracker on his wrist. She slammed it against the Dissonance engine's control panel on his belt. The settings scrambled. The destination was overwritten. She had input the coordinates herself. His home universe. "The trail," she whispered, her body going limp in his arms. "Break the trail." The overlords burst into the lab, their metal forms gleaming in the red light. They raised their energy weapons. Alex, holding the corpse of another Natasha, slammed his hand on the engine's activation rune. The world of static and metal dissolved into the familiar, screaming colors of the breach. Part 4. The crawling home. He landed back in his basement. The smell of ozone and dust was overwhelming. He collapsed onto the concrete floor, Natasha's body still in his arms. He lay there for a long time, sobbing, screaming, the horrors of the multiverse etched permanently onto his psyche. Finally, he pushed himself up. He looked at the woman he had brought back. It was Natasha, but it wasn't his Natasha. This was a refugee from a hellscape, her body a testament to sufferings he could barely comprehend. He had wanted to save her. In the end, all he had done was retrieve her body from one prison to bury it in another. He carried her upstairs into the light of his own world. The sun was shining. Birds were singing. The normalcy of it was obscene. He laid her on their bed, covering her with a blanket. He would give her a proper burial. It was the least he could do, as he turned to go, to get a shovel, to plan, to finally break down. He heard a sound, a wet, tearing sound. He spun around. The body under the blanket was moving. It was twitching, the limbs contorting at impossible angles. The blanket slid away. The ports and scars on Natasha's skin were opening, not bleeding, but gaping. And from them, things were emerging. Thin, metallic tendrils, like the wires that had been in her in the spire. They writhed, probing the air. They were tipped with sharp surgical tools, with camera lenses, with needles. The overlords hadn't just been using her as a battery. They had infested her. They had turned her into a Trojan horse. A seed, her head lolled to the side and her eyes opened. They were no longer human. They were glowing, cold blue orbs of light. World 7 Gamma identified. A flat, synthesized voice said from her mouth. Resource assessment initiated. Dissonance engine technology confirmed. Preparing for signal transmission. It was a scout, an infiltrator. Alex backed away, his horror complete. He hadn't saved her. He had doomed his entire world. The Natasha thing sat up, its movements jerky, unnatural. The metallic tendrils sprouting from its body lengthened, scraping against the floor and walls, tasting the air of this new, pristine world. Primary objective: secure the Dissonance engine. Secondary objective: pave the way for the main force. It stood, its body a grotesque marionette of flesh and machine. It took a step towards him. Alex ran. He fled his own home, the screams finally tearing from his throat not in grief, but in a pure, unadulterated terror. He had looked into the multiverse for his wife, and the multiverse had looked back. And it was now crawling out of his bed, wearing her face, to consume everything he had ever known. He had to get to the engine. He had to destroy it, just as she had said. Break the trail. But as he sprinted towards the basement door, he heard the sound of more tearing metal, more synthesized voices from inside his house. The infestation was spreading, adapting, building. The horror was no longer out there, in the infinite. It was here. And he had delivered it, wrapped in the skin of the woman he loved, straight into the heart of his own world. The hunt was over. The survival had just begun, and he was the prey, in a universe that was now just another layer of hell.